So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, a household name to everyone, I would imagine, and a revered politician, the Right Honourable Jack Straw. I made some notes here, and I think they'll hopefully come up on the screen behind me. He held office as Home Secretary in 1997 to 2001, Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary 2001 to 2006, and after a short spell as Leader of the House of Commons, Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice 2007 to 2010. So quite an innings, I have to say, Jack. So, and also being from Ken Shackleton's neck of the woods, that's why they're sat next to each other, they can understand each other. He's an avid Blackburn Rovers fan. I have got that right, haven't I? Yes, good. And was given the freedom of the borough of Blackburn and Darwin in 2015. Mr. Straw is going to give us his thoughts about how the UK is perceived by the rest of the world right now, how we're coping with COVID and hopefully post-COVID, and how we're doing with our departure from the EU. So can we have a very, very warm welcome for the Right Honourable Jack Straw.
Thanks very much, Tim, and ladies and gentlemen. That list of the jobs I held during the 13 years of the Labour government gives rise to a quiz question, which I offer you all, which is how many people who were appointed to the cabinet in 1997 were still in the cabinet in the year 2010 when we left office, and how many of those were English? Anyway, the total was 3, which is Alistair Darling, Gordon Brown, and me, and the English person was me, which I'm very proud of. But it also is a reminder of just how uncertain life in ministerial office can be, and I was reminded about that last week when you had the reshuffle. I was really lucky. I sometimes thought, why am I surviving? But in the run-up to reshuffles, some of your colleagues who may have been fingered in the press were very, very nervous. And then when you got to the cabinet for the next cabinet meeting, and there were these absent faces who suddenly, some deserved to be removed, others didn't deserve to be removed. And if I think about last week's reshuffle, 1 or 2 deserved to be moved in my view, but Robert Buckland, who was one of my successors as Lord Chancellor, doing a really good job, working very hard to try and restore the justice system into some sort of working order, having good relations with the judiciary, for which they are deeply grateful. And he suddenly pushed aside. And I know why. That was because Mr. Johnson wanted to get Mr. Raab out of the Foreign Office and wanted to park him somewhere, which is in justice because he's a lawyer. Those of you who are familiar with what happened in the aftermath of the French Revolution may know about the Committee of Public Safety, which was running France in its first republic, with Robespierre in pole position. And every so often, one of the members of the Committee of Public Safety would be gone, and that's because they were locked up and they were about to lose their heads. And this insanity went on until finally Robespierre lost his head, and then Napoleon came in, and some sort of, in French terms, normality returned. I spent 13 years in government, sandwiched between 18 years at the beginning and 5 years at the end of opposition. And government is better than opposition, but you can do a great deal in opposition as well, if you put both on the national scene, but also in terms of representing your constituents. And in my view, lots of people will say the British political system is dead, or it's wrecked. I don't agree with that. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better operating and cleaner than almost any system in Europe, with a single exception of some of the Nordics. and certainly than the United States, which is it's no wonder they have such deadlock in their system. But aside from anything else, the American system really is corrupt. If you ever looked at the way in which they draw constituency boundaries, it is completely disgraceful. It's done by whichever party happens to be in control of that state for the time being, with the most appalling results. And I was saying to Ken, who, by the way, as you've heard from Tim, to blame for me being here, that after 36 years in opposition, in the Commons, and of 13 in government and 30 altogether on the front bench, I wanted a rest from the relentlessness of being a member of Parliament, but I didn't want to lose touch with my constituency. It's true, Tim, that's how I know Ken. I'm actually from Essex, which, anybody else from Essex here? Yeah, well, I mean, we're a small minority, completely misunderstood, and the butt of endless jokes by people who don't understand the beauty and sophistication of the county, because they get most of their ideas from the only way is Essex, which happens, by the way, to be based in the town where I went to school and the town where I was born. But I'm a sort of adopted Lancastrian. But I didn't want to lose touch with Blackburn. About a year before I was due to finish, having announced I was retiring, a great friend of mine who runs a very large wallpaper company, family company, Graham and Brown, Andrew Graham, who would help to set up this Blackburn Youth Zone, said to me, would I be willing to take over from him as chairman when I finished as MP? So I thought about it. I said, how much time is it going to take? So he said, it's fine, Jack. Only a day every 2 months, said Andrew. Well, this is later fessed up. I mean, he lied because a lot of weeks, it's been more than a day a week. But I really enjoyed it. And we last week, a group of us, including the staff and some of the youngsters we are there for, went and received the award which the Youth Zone has been made of the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service, which is a fantastic achievement. And you could see people's pride in what we've achieved. And we cater for 1,000 youngsters in this purpose-built youth centre in the centre of town. And we couldn't do that unless we were able to raise a very large amount of money, over £400,000 from local businesses, one of which is the Cardboard Box Company, I'm pleased to say. But also, as Ken, I think, will tell you, involves a sort of partnership as well. I mean, we're after people's money, but we're after much more than that, and also setting up a network, which I think business people have found really helpful. So I was talking to somebody who I'd brought in to the Youth Zone as a patron about 6 months ago, who was asking me where I was going, and I started with Cardboard, the Sheep Plant Association. She said, yes, we've just become customers of theirs. I'll tell you who it was later. Ken, you can pay me my commission, if that's what you do these days. But Tim said what he wanted to do was to talk about where the UK was today and how you cope with current challenges and how we're seen abroad. Well, I mean, how we're seen abroad is, it varies, it always did, even when Margaret Thatcher was in her prime and then followed by Tony Blair, two leaders of the country who happened to be able to walk very tall on the world stage, and those are really, apart from Clem Attlee and Winston Churchill in the late 40s and early 50s, the only two we've had in the last 75 years. Even then, the opinions differed about the United Kingdom abroad. But and a lot was in the context of us once being one of the world's most powerful empires, as we were up to the First World War, and to a degree through that until after the Second World War. But to quote a man called Dean Acheson, who was a US Secretary of State in the early 50s when he said rather unkindly that Britain had lost an empire but failed to find a role. And Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair was seeking to fill that gap. These days, principally because of the shock around the world, and it was a shock about the decision of the British people in respect of Brexit, I think the jury's out in many parts about where Britain is going and what influence it can secure in the future. I mean, just a word about Brexit itself. I campaigned for us to stay in the European Union, not because I loved the institution. I mean, anybody who had to spend as much time as I had in Brussels and Luxembourg negotiating with colleagues and doing deals would, I think, not have affection for the institution, but I thought that it was historically far better than the alternative way that European powers had dealt with each other, which was by starting one war after another. And that, although it was far from perfect, we'd face much greater uncertainty if we were to leave. However, we did leave. That was a decision by the British people. And I've certainly, unlike some people who were in favour of staying in, I've lost no sleep at all about the fact we've left. Because in my view, historically, it will be seen that it was the EU, most of all, that brought this on itself, the fact that it lost one of its largest members, by the inflexible way in which it operated. And its refusal really from the time that we went in 1973 to accept that the British economy is slightly differently characterised than respectively the French and the German economies, which was how the EU was designed. I assume that others in this room may have seen what my old opposite number, Michel Barnier, recently said, because he wants to secure the right-wing nomination, the Republican nomination in France to become president. Good luck to him. He's a nice man, but he's very inflexible, and he didn't help the negotiation. Now, part of Britain's problem in the EU was, number one, decisions of the European Court of Justice. That's the one that's based in Luxembourg. It's there to arbitrate on arguments about what's in the EU treaties. And under the European Communities Act 1972, its decisions overrode those of the British courts and indeed of the British Parliament. And this is a lawyer's point, but it's really important. The ECJ over the years had developed this idea of a living law by which their court could interpret treaties by reference to the current circumstances, in complete contrast to what had always been accepted in international law, was that you interpreted treaties according to what was the intention of the parties at the time the words were written on the paper, which is a much more sensible way of doing it. And that's why you've had this creeping confidence in the EU in one area after another. Well, Michel Barnier has said he wants to cut down the ECJ to size. I mean, having been lecturing us during the course of the Brexit, post-Brexit negotiations, that could ever happen. And also says he wants better to control illegal migration into France. Well, it was migration, both from within the EU and into the EU, which was the single strongest cause of our leaving, because a lot of my former constituents and plenty others, particularly those in lower paid jobs, resented what they thought was a means by which employers could bring in people from Eastern Europe who were willing to tolerate lower wages and poorer conditions, rather than providing training opportunities here and paying more here, as they believed they should have been, and also just felt marginalised by this. But the decision the UK made in June 2016, as I say, was seen as a sort of, well, first of all, it was a shock. An awful lot of countries never expected that we would leave. And it also led to suggestions that we were giving up world influence and becoming more insular again. I think, self-evidently, I don't speak for this government, I'm in the other party, but this government, I think, is very conscious of that, which is, and I talk to quite a lot of the people in this government still, which is why they've developed this idea of global Britain, of getting ministers, business people, and British embassies and high commissions to really sort of campaign for Britain's role in the world, and to better to advertise some of the fantastic things, including, I'm very, very sorry that Richard, that the money wasn't there. Of course, if we'd been in office, if Drayson had been there, he would have had it immediately. If I was still in office, I would have slipped you a cheque on the way out. I mean, being no doubt about that. I mean, there are some, fantastic businesses. We have brilliant universities. Disproportionately, four British universities, Oxford, Cambridge, University College London at the moment, St Andrews, are in the top 10 of world universities. And for a medium-sized country, this is an extraordinary achievement. And thankfully, these days, those universities are there because they're scientific and engineering achievements. So and you are now getting the kind of partnership between universities, government, and industry. And if you go to Oxford, Cambridge, plenty of other big university cities, there are science parks where things which have been developed within universities are spun off by entrepreneurs willing to risk their own money in them, for both for their good, but also for the greater good. And I think this global Britain approach should be successful. And where we in government, I mean, I don't mean it had Mr. Corbyn won, which would have been a treat for everybody. Especially for somebody like me, because I think my pals and I probably would have been the subject to a committee of public safety and almost certainly declared non-citizens. But I've almost lost my. I mean, I told you the merits of Mr. Corbyn. But I think that a government of a different hue, a Labour government, is likely to carry this kind of campaign on, and whatever sometimes it may say about it today. I'm very well aware that at the moment, the combination of COVID and apparently of Brexit is causing some quite severe labour shortages, increases in raw material or feed material prices, and in wage increases. And I've talked within the Blackburn Youth Zone, as I say, we've got most, not all, but most of the major and medium-sized firms in the area. It's a big manufacturing area which aren't owned by a multinational, are amongst our patrons and therefore our sponsors. And they all are facing this problem. But I had two, when I was there for 3 days last week, two saying to me that it was difficult to, I'll come on to freight prices and HDV drivers in a second, which is a discrete issue. But on the general issue, the fact that you could no longer go to an agency and get East European, often very well qualified staff to come and work doing boring or tedious jobs for relatively low wages was a difficulty. But on the other hand, both these two quite separate conversations said they thought it was a good thing. It was going to cause problems, but it was a good thing because it would force wages up, and that and it would force firms to think more imaginatively about how people were used, and was likely to lead to an increase in productivity. And I happen to think that that is the case. And whether I think that or not, I'm quite sure that that's the reason why the government is being very firm about not permitting visa arrangements for middle and lower qualified people to come in here, because they're trying to, albeit by a shock, to create a shift in the culture of British businesses and to see productivity increase. And although you can argue about how the data are collected about relative comparative productivity figures, there isn't any doubt that British productivity has lagged behind other comparable countries. And one of the reasons is because we've had availability of relatively cheap labour. So, I mean, I can think of plenty of factories, really good factories in Blackburn, where, I mean, I've said to people, I said to the MD as our chief executive going around, out of hearing, why are we having people doing that job when, you know, the technology for doing that process on a conveyor belt was established 60 years ago, and a machine to do it wouldn't cost very much. And they say to me, yeah, I know that. They all know that. But it's still cheaper to employ these people to do this very tedious, mind-blowingly tedious jobs. Well, if that's going to change, I think that's a good thing. And meanwhile, the other thing that's going to happen is that in a lot of areas, you've got this paradox. It's absolutely true in the north of England, and it is in many parts of the northwest as well, and I suspect the Midlands, where there are apparent labour shortages, but there are also some thousands of people who are currently very difficult to employ. They're of working age, but they may come from families where no one's been in work for a very long time. Getting them into work and with the sufficient skills to go and work is really hard. And however, if we can't do that, then we're going to have continue with an underclass in this country, which is profoundly unfair to them and destabilising for our society. And I'm pleased to say this is one of the things we were doing in the Blackburn Youth Zone. We've just signed a big contract with the Department of Work and Pensions for what's called a youth hub, by which DWP, government money, is putting a lot of money into identifying these youngsters and having them trained up. But the first point of contact is not a DWP office with everything that involves, and including sometimes a sense of failure by people, but the Blackburn Youth Zone, this very bright orange building in the middle of town. They may well have been in there anyway, just to enjoy themselves. We've now got civil servants physically located in an office in the youth zone, along with youth workers and other experts, to identify these youngsters and to provide them with proper training and then to follow it through. And with luck, that may mean there is a greater availability of reasonably motivated, qualified labour, not tomorrow, but in due course. I mean, just on HDV drivers, because when I had lunch, everybody was talking about the fact that your raw materials have gone up, but also the huge increase in freight charges. And there's this shortage of HGV drivers. One member, Tim, commented that interesting to him was that this was also a problem faced by countries and companies in Europe on the mainland as well as here. I mean, if I were in government, I'd argue very strongly that for the time being, you've got to allow people from Europe or anywhere else who are qualified to drive heavy goods vehicles to come in, because you can't magic these people overnight. None of the youngsters or even older people who we're trying to get back into employment, frankly, are going to be potentially available to turn themselves into HDV drivers. Some of them may not even be able to drive a motor car in less than a couple of years. The degree to which you can improve productivity when it comes in the short term, maybe in the long term, in the short term, to shifting goods around is very limited. So I would certainly think there's a strong case, and I hope your trade associations, I know the CBI and the Chambers of Commerce that are making this, just to keep up the government to say, you've got to change this. And one of the truths about government, however strongly you may feel about sticking to one position, I mean, as John Maynard Keynes famously said, if the facts change, I change. And you just have to keep at the government. And sometimes, quite often, if you're sitting there behind the desk, you think, oh, well, okay, I know I was going to die in a ditch on this one, but what's the point? We need to make a concession. Last thing just to say, and I'm very happy to take some questions. I think we've got a little bit of time. I was incredibly lucky to do those four jobs in government, and I mean also, by the way, that they were in the 13 years only really changed jobs completely. For 5 years, that's when I've moved from being Home Secretary to being Foreign Secretary, because the other two jobs I had later on were basically their content was very, very similar, and the Justice Department was half the old Home Office had gone into the new Justice Department, and so it's the same subjects, whereas lots and lots of ministers end up shifting sort of every couple of years or less, and you never get really a chance to build up an expertise in that. But what I was going to say was that I know some people want to be football players, some people want to be racing drivers. I, from the age of about 16, had this conceit that I'd like to be a member of Parliament, which sounds a bit sad, really. But anyway, I was lucky enough to be able to make it. And aside from anything else, I can talk about all my achievements. It's also a lot of fun. And I had some great moments, and I was reflecting as I drove across here. My role in helping the crime statistics, this is late 1979. I'm sitting in this decrepit 2-up, 2-down house we had in the middle of Blackburn, which is the Blackburn Labour Party office, with windows, by the way, which were yellow, and yellow from nicotine. 50 years of meetings in smoke-filled rooms. It was disgusting. There was a yard outside and another yard which led to a club. And while I was interviewing somebody in the upstairs room, I heard glass break and what appeared to be somebody breaking a window from inside, and looked out. And there was this guy who was obviously had just finished burgling the place and was trying to make his escape. So I said to I was a very good runner in those days, and I was in my mid-30s. So I said to my constituent, who was in his 50s and not particularly fit, come with me. And I shot outside with him trailing some yards behind. There were two ways this guy could go. One was into the town, the other was down this Gindle to me. But to his misfortune, he turned left rather than right, and almost collided with me. I said, hey, and he shot up off the street. So I pounded after him, and we sprinted, must have been about half a mile, up one street, down another, and then, I haven't made this up, in Nab Lane. So I was just interested, because I'm a tiny bit competitive, just wanted to catch him. But anyway, he suddenly stopped. And I thought to myself, cripes, what do I do now? It'd be far better if he got away. But anyway, I grabbed him, and he sort of swore at me, but I just grabbed hold of him. And then my poor wheezing constituent came along. And the reason this guy stopped was because I'd exhausted him, I'm pleased to say. The police station was only about 100 yards away, so we marched him off there with this guy effing and blinding and all this stuff, but he didn't have the strength really to get away. Go into the bridewell at the police station. A station sergeant came out, and he looked at me and he said, yes, Mr. Straw, what can I do for you? So we were hanging on to this bloke. So I said, well, this bloke's just burgled the Nalgo club. So I also haven't made this up. This is why I remember it 41 years later. So the station sergeant said to him, "Is this right, mate? Have you just burgled the Nalgate Club?" And he said, "Yes." So station sergeant said, "Right, you're nicked." And he got 6 months on the following Monday. There we are. And I got a photograph in the newspaper. Such is life and times of a young MP, if nothing else. I'm going to finish there, but I'm delighted to take some questions and hopefully give you decent answers as well. Thank you very much. Could you pass me my water? Ken, may I have my water, please?
I'm more than happy to start if there's some shy people. I do have
Thanks very much. Tim, yeah, go on. I'll be able to hear you in this room.
Okay, well, I'll ask very loud. I have a question about the perceived longevity of the EU and whether you have an opinion. Will the Union survive, and who would you expect to be the next to leave?
Right. I think the EU will survive as long as France and Germany think it's in their interests for it to survive. I mean, the provenance of the EU was that both come for different reasons. I mean, France wasn't wrecked because of its humiliation surrender to Hitler in 1941. I mean, 1940. Germany was completely wrecked. I mean, we all know that, but I've just read an extraordinary work by a German historian. It was written in German, translated, called The Aftermath of what happened in the 4 years immediately after the fall of Berlin. And it's extraordinary to the degree to which it was completely wrecked, far worse than anything we'd experienced, even in places like Liverpool or Coventry. And it was a consequence of the leaders of these two countries, realizing that they'd better not have any more wars together, which after all they'd been, it was not 2 but 3 wars in 70 years. 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, 1914, and then 1939, and they had to stop. And the institutions of the EU arose from this by Monet and others, a French diplomat, and they're very much in the image of this Franco-German alliance. It's very strong. There's a very strong bilateral treaty there. And as I saw when we were members of the EU, if in our case it was 3 big countries decided on something, the other 23 had to go along with it. It's just how it is. It's big. And now, will that break? I think, Tim, there may be some changes. I think, joking aside, I think Michel Barnier's intervention in this is absolutely fascinating. That this guy who, I mean, nobody was a greater believer in the EU and all its works than this man. He was the negotiator. He was a man who was refusing to make any concessions in advance. And yet, he's just said he's in favour of one of the major things that most people here were seeking. And had that been achieved before June 2016, I don't think we would have left, because the reason for leaving actually would have gone. So I think they will have to change. And there is, I mean, part of the problem with the EU is that it's very difficult to get a decision. Once you've got a decision, it's almost impossible to change it because of majority voting. That's the flip. And you've got this court, which is completely unaccountable. The only way you can change what the court decides is if you can then get a decision to override it, and you can't because of the problem of majority voting, and you're having to. And it's so easy to have a blocking minority. So I think it will change, but it's also already weaker. That's the truth of it. It's weaker without us, and they know it. And despite that, I mean, the French hysterically, synthetically, going on about this deal that's been struck between the US, the UK, and Australia. By the way, I mean, they're just screeching, because, I mean, let me say, they would have done exactly the same I mean, France, UK and US haven't been lily white in the way they've approached arms contracts by other countries. But we are purist white compared to France. Put in arms contracts, France, bribery, and see what you come up with. Well, you might come up with nothing, mightn't you? So I'm not saying anything adverse against the French. But anyway, I think I've really tried to answer it. I mean, the other thing I'd say is it's and here I do slightly criticise this government. We've really got, we still, okay, so the proportion of our trade with Europe is less than it was. It's about 40%, and it's slightly going down. And that, therefore, with other countries, is going up a bit, and the United States is still our biggest trading partner, and we run a trade surplus with the US, whereas we've got a whopping deficit with the EU. But they're really important, and they're close as well. And I think this government ought to invest more diplomatic effort in getting alongside the EU countries and actually in Brussels as well. And it's so much, I mean, I realised this when I went in, when I was Home Secretary, when I first started negotiating with the EU. The politics at a local, national level and at an EU level is much more to do with personal relationships than British politics is. British politics is, I mean, it matters, of course, but very institutionalised. And it's not the same. We've got very fluid parties as well. So the more you can get on side with these people and use our very good diplomatic corps as well, the better. Does that answer your question?
It does, Jack. Thank you. I've hogged the mic long enough. Anybody else got any questions? We've got Jack for a while, so please, if you've got any questions, I'll bring the mic to you.
You shout. Why don't you shout?
There we are, Gavin.
You're just sort of picking up on that point. If we put aside the political and the judicial side of what we left, is there any likelihood or even benefit in trying to reinstate some kind of economic union, for want of a better word?
First of all, I think it's very difficult to envisage how that could happen, because the whole purpose of the post-Brexit decision negotiations was to establish future relationship. And as you'll know, that on which Theresa May came to grief. There were quite a lot of people arguing in my party and inside the Conservative Party that Britain should try and have a relationship which, as closely as possible, replicated the deal we had before on the single market. Anyway, Mr. Johnson decided, for whatever reason, I understand the reasons, and who knows what decision I would have taken if I'd been in his seat, not to go down that route. And therefore, we do have to take a lot of the rules of the EU if we want to sell into their market, but we have a greater degree of flexibility. And I think on balance, it's likely to be to our benefit. Anyway, that's where it is. I would see no chance of there being any change in that for 20 years. Maybe in 20 years' time, who knows what could happen. And there are some areas where I think we're going to drift apart a bit, and obviously there's this terrible rubbing point of the Northern Irish border. I mean, not the border with the Republic, which is open, but the border with the UK. And the EU, in my view, needs to show some flexibility there, for the obvious reasons of having shops in Northern Ireland unstocked. Anyway, but that's my view.
Next question.
Okay, I've got 1 minute. So Ken. A big round of applause, please, to Mr. Ken Shackleton from the Blackburn Card Company.
There won't be applause after I've asked this question, that's for sure. Quite intriguingly, what are your views on what's happening, what has happened and what might happen going forward in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Completely off scale.
Right, thanks. So I was appalled by the way in which the American government chose to pull out. I don't share this view that you have to, against what Mr. Biden calls forever wars. Right? I mean, Tony Blair was, I thought, brilliant and unusually cutting in what he described out as imbecilic. Because, I mean, Joe Biden's argument was basically, well, we've been there for 20 years, it's leading to a forever war, we need to get out. The Americans' forces have been in Europe for 75 years, right? And the result of that is they've helped to produce a forever peace. So there's no rule that says you have to be there 20 years. What I know is, because I was Foreign Secretary when 9/11 happened, and I was, I think, the first Western foreign minister to go into Kabul after its fall, is that over that, in the 20 years since, life has improved dramatically for the majority of Afghans, and particularly for women. One just brief story. The first time I went to Afghanistan, I went there loads of times, I was taken to a girls' school on the outskirts of Kabul, which had been built as a two-story building, but the Taliban had shelled the top half in the previous civil war, so it was just one story. These women, who were teachers and parents, were re-establishing the school for their girls, because it was going to reopen. First time since, from before the Taliban had been in office. One of the women, I've never ever forgotten this, produced for me an official-looking piece of paper in the local language, Dari, and said, through an interpreter, look at this, Mr. Straw. So I asked the interpreter to translate it. It was her record from the local court of her conviction and her crime for which she'd been punished and for which she could have gone to jail was educating her daughter. I mean, this is, it's worse than medieval. So, and we were able to change that. And now, loads of mistakes made on the way, not least that we didn't, and we, the US particularly, weren't tough enough with the Pakistanis, who talk out of two sides of their mouth on the Taliban. They say, well, they're against them, but they're up to the necks with them. And only two countries recognized the previous Taliban government: Saudi Arabia, which provided most of the 9/11 bombers, and Pakistan. So anyway, there could have been a case for a gradual withdrawing, but if you're negotiating to withdraw, here's one of the paradoxes which military history teaches us. If you're going to do that, you need to increase your garrison and your force effort at the point of negotiation, so that you're negotiating from strength, and you don't let the other side know that you're going to withdraw until you've signed on the dotted line. That was the only way in which we got the IRA to the negotiating table, by the way, when they realised when we realised we couldn't win, but they realised that they couldn't win either, and they carry on losing a lot of their people. Then they came. But so, anyway, lots of mistakes. As for the future in Afghanistan, given what's happened, it's pretty dismal. However, and what the American government has done is frozen the Taliban's money. And they'll earn some money, as they always have done, out of selling heroin. Some money will leak in. The Taliban will be hoping that Pakistan's main ally, China, will help them, and also that Russia may help. But neither the Chinese nor the Russians have got any interest in supporting extremist Islamists, because both of them have got big problems from such groups within their own country. So with a bit of luck, that may be able to put the squeeze on them, and it may lead, for example, to them accepting down the track that girls should be educated above primary level, and that women should be able to go to work. But it may not happen, again, and you could have yet another bloody civil war. There we are.
Thank you. Jack, I wonder if you could just remind us of the charity that you're working for, because Jack has very kindly forgone his fees for today, and is actually, we were
Thank you very much. Yeah, there. So it's the Blackburn Youth Zone. It's one of a network, particularly in the northwest, of youth zones. There isn't a picture there of, oh, yeah, there is. It's just, that's this very iconic looking building, which was, the money, by the way, I made no political point here at all, happened to come from the government that was in power between 2005 and 2010. And I can't remember which one it was. Anyway, you see the light coming through the top windows. That's because there's a seven-a-side football pitch on the roof. It's quite, and we've got fantastic facilities. We've got a recreation area, multi-sport youth area. We've got lots of music facilities. We've got a dance floor, and we've got two boxing gym with 2 rings in it. And boxing for youngsters, women as well as men, from less aspirational homes, providing boxing, it can be really, really important. So I'm really enthusiastic about it. We get more than 1,000 kids a week through there doing all sorts of things. We have a budget this year of about 1.3 million. We only get 170,000 from the council, and the rest we have to raise ourselves. About half of that comes from grants and trusts of various kinds, and the other half comes from fantastically generous local businesses, including Ken's cardboard box company. So thank you very much.